It's a David and Goliath battle between Filipino fishermen and the might of the Chinese Navy. Tensions in the South China Sea are soaring as the Philippines accuses Beijing of blocking its fishing fleets and intimidating its Coast Guard. Washington says it's got Manila's back, but where does President Duterte stand? Plus, is space tourism for the super rich a giant leap for mankind or a waste of money that could be far better spent down here on Earth? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. It covers 3.5 million square kilometers. It's rich in resources, vital for trade, and the source of serious geopolitical tension. Brunei, Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam, and the Philippines have all staked their claims to the South China Sea. But Beijing's pursuit of the vital waterway is by far the most aggressive. The dispute is decades old, but in the last few years, it's taken a turn for the worse. And many in the region blame Beijing. China is desperate to control the contested waters. They are rich in oil and gas, and more than $3 trillion in trade passes through every year. Since 2014, Beijing has been militarizing the South China Sea, turning small islands and reefs into naval bases. And this year, tensions between Beijing and Manila hit a new high after China deployed more ships to disputed areas. Washington came to the Philippines' defense, warning Beijing of its commitment to protect Manila from Chinese aggression. And this is how Beijing responded.
China urges the United States to stop abusing international law, stop the use of force or the threat of force, and stop making provocations in the South China Sea. It should abide by international law underpinned by the UN Charter and respect China's sovereignty and rights and interests in the South China Sea, instead of going further down the wrong path. China will continue to firmly defend its sovereignty, rights, interests, and security in accordance with law, firmly protect friendly, cooperative relations with regional countries, and firmly safeguard peace and stability in the South China Sea.
Well, joining me now from Beijing is China Affairs analyst Einar Tangen. From Manila is Jay Batong Bakal, a former legal advisor to the Filipino government on maritime issues. And from Berlin, Greg Austin, senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and author of Cybersecurity in China. Thanks all so much for being with us. First, let's talk about the latest round of tension between Manila and Beijing. An international tribunal at The Hague actually ruled against China, as per the fishing rights Manila was claiming. China has basically treated that ruling, as a joke. Einar, why? On what grounds can China effectively ignore the ruling of a recognized international court?
Well, it's a recognized international court based on UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention of Laws of the Sea. China was a signatory, but before it signed, it passed internal laws and had a reservation that its historical areas would not be up for any kind of dispute. You have to remember that China was the undisputed heavyweight economically for over 2,000 years, until the colonial era ushered in, Britain, France, etc., and things like that. So they have long-standing, what they believe are historical rights, both by discovery and occupation, which they say is based on archaeological evidence and also mentions in various historical treaties, and that they had dominion control. And I think that's quite clear for that period of time. China was the heavyweight power. So they see that as their historical area, and they did not put that into the kitty when they joined UNCLOS. Now remember, the United States is not a member of UNCLOS, although it was the one who started all of this stuff because they wanted to extend, we wanted to extend our territorial waters to another 200 miles because we had large oceans on both sides of us. So that's where the situation is. Beijing believes it has historical dominion, and there are many disputes out there.
But Beijing was privy to the negotiations that drafted UNCLOS, and the argument now is if China won't take that convention, on the law of the sea seriously and won't respect international tribunals because of historical claims, they say. What are the options for resolution of disputes? I'm actually going to put that to Jay, because is that enough of an argument, what Einar has put forward?
Well, that is China's argument. But then again, when you look at the history of how China has presented its claims since 1947, it was never really cleared whether it was actually claiming dominion all over the seas. No? At best, at the time that these claims were publicized by China, at the time, the law of the sea wasn't even negotiated at that time. And most states, all states claim basically land territory. And so when these maps containing China's claims were presented, there was actually a question as to exactly what were they claiming. Was it just the land, or did it include all of the waters inside that area? And so since international law did not countenance the acquisition of sovereignty over areas of the high seas, countries basically did not see it in the way that China is now presenting it, as a claim to all of the areas within the 9-dash line map that they presented. So this is really a problem, because it then appears to quite a lot of states that, it was like China is signing this treaty with fingers crossed behind its back. And the clarification, or rather the assertion of more strident assertion of rights that equate to nearly sovereignty over all of the South China Sea, from the perspective of these countries, only came only recently, since in the past few years only.
Okay.
Because that is when they think that China finally is clarifying the extent of the powers or the claims that it was making in the South China Sea.
Okay. Let me get Greg in the conversation here. I mean, as Einar pointed out, the United States is not a signatory really to UNCLOS, and the United States is saying that actually they can, intervene on Philippines' behalf, whether or not they're part of the maritime agreement there, because they feel that China is actually not just making claims to the area of water, they're also making claims to the seabed as well as the skies above it, which also affects U.S. security. Can it really be justified from the U.S. standpoint to be involved in this dispute?
Well, I think it can be, because the United States has very large and substantial interests in the South China Sea, security of shipping, security of its allies, such as the Philippines. But I think that the main underlying problem here is that history and law are not neat phenomena. So what happened in the 1970s was that states decided they want 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone, more jurisdiction over maritime resources. And so what that led to was a rush for maritime resources, China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia even. And there are a number of unresolved historical and legal matters, even from the 1940s, 1950s, and they were, in a sense, overtaken by these very complex issues of maritime jurisdiction. So the US is definitely right to be there, but China's got some stakes in there that it believes it has some rights as well.
Right. Einar, I'll let you respond quickly before we move on to other issues here.
Yeah, well, I think the idea that a country has interest somewhere because they have trade could be applied to every country on Earth. So I don't necessarily buy into that. The U.S. has 400 bases. They have a number of allies. They can say that they back their allies, but this is not a dispute just between China and the Philippines. Remember, all of the claimants that are surrounding it have at least 4 disputes. 3, in this case, 3 with other nations. And what is rarely mentioned is that Taiwan, which the U.S. is always vaunting, has exactly the same territorial claims that the mainland has. So this idea that somehow that this is China versus the rest of the world is nonsense. In terms of this idea of China is ignoring an international convention, as I said, they passed a law prior to joining saying that these historical areas were theirs. And if you want to get into who's ignored them, international conventions, we could go a long list with the United States and the International Criminal Court. The U.S. has said repeatedly that it will not subject itself to anybody else's jurisdiction. So this would be the pot calling the kettle black if it was in fact saying that the U.S. is blaming China because it's, quote, violating the UN conventions, because the U.S. does it all the time.
Okay. Unfortunately, the clock is against us, so I need to move on to this with Jay very quickly. This dispute between the Philippines and China has caused some pretty serious domestic divisions within the Philippines. President Duterte has long wanted to build this bond with China. He thinks that's the ally that can best benefit Philippines' economic interests. But can he really manage the balance between reaping the advantages of that strong relationship with China while also protecting the interests of the Filipinos, not least the fishermen?
Well, I think the past 5 years have shown that he cannot, no? Because despite these past 5 years, all the promises that China made for him to, in exchange for the accommodations that he gave him, none of them have really come to fruition. No? From $24 billion worth of infrastructure that were promised in 2016, less than $1 billion were had been realized as of last year, and they're still signing loan agreements. So in terms of the benefits that he thought he was going to get from China, it's clear that that has not come true. So with the people, especially with the people seeing the disadvantages of the relationship, like the entry of the offshore gambling operations that became very dominant in the public discourse, it was seen as a loss of jobs, opportunities, as well as the entry of unsavory activities. And then now with the pandemic having also come in, and the fishermen's plight becoming more and more desperate, even up to now, the people simply don't see eye to eye with Duterte on this. And public opinion polls have constantly been at odds with his own personal views. No? So that is creating quite a lot of backlash against his administration, actually up to now.
Very quickly, Jay, do you think he can manage his way out of this and the dissatisfaction among his own, what would have been his own supporters? He can't have it both ways.
No, he can't, but definitely he's trying his hardest to try to push through with what he wants, despite the opposition. Unfortunately, I think the opposition is still gaining ground, but I'm not sure whether it will be enough, no? Especially with the elections coming up next year. The Duterte administration has decided to try to respond to public criticism by now presenting a very robust posture towards China. So that this year it's really very different how they're relating with China compared to the last 5 years.
Okay. I'd like to broaden that out at this point. Greg, let me come back to you. I mean, how gravely could this dispute between China and the Philippines and many others now in the South China Sea, how gravely could this really escalate, especially when we consider the militarization, the bases that are being built in the region? What are your fears?
Well, it's a very good question. The building by China of these military bases in the middle of the South China Sea on disputed reefs was a huge strategic shock to the area, and it created all sorts of new insecurities and tensions. On the other hand, a former Australian Prime Minister said about the South China Sea islands in the 1990s, how long does something have to be on the list of flashpoints without going off before we take it off the list of flashpoints? And while I think the confrontations in the South China Sea are important strategically, they have to be studied, they have to be, in a sense, we have to prevent more violent conflict. But for the moment, I think the risks of more violent conflict are quite low. China is being a bit like a bully, to be frank, but it's got legitimate interests in the South China Sea, including territorial claims. As was mentioned, Taiwan also has the same territorial claims as China, dating back at least the wartime period. So I don't think it's going to go off anytime soon.
Okay, but can you pinpoint something that worries you the most? I mean, is it potentially the fishing rights or the security and military interests or Taiwan, or are they all equally kind of dangerous?
Well, I think Taiwan is the most important island in the South China Sea. People don't often think of it as in the South China Sea, but it's at the northern end of the South China Sea. And I think we have to watch Taiwan very closely. I think China's playing a very quiet and slow diplomatic game in the South China Sea. It's got a bit more heavy, a bit more bully-like in the last few years. But China's biggest stake in international strategic relationships in the region for the next 40 years is going to be Taiwan. And so that's an important spot to watch.
Right. Einar, I mean, China has said repeatedly it wants peace in the South China Sea. But as Jay was saying, many of its neighbors feel China signs agreements and says these words with their fingers crossed behind their back. So are you concerned that this could escalate dangerously?
Yeah, yes, I am. And I mean, for the Chinese perspective, they think the biggest bully in the area is the United States, which has the largest military and keeps, sailing its ships up and down in between the Taiwan Straits and things like this, and these freedom of navigations. What if the circumstances were reversed and China was sailing ships off of New York and San Diego? I think there would be some consternation there, and that feeling that China was being a bully there. So the situation as it is untenable. At some point, there has to be some creativity. And this is not the Chinese government position, but I do think that Beijing has to be more creative. I mean, the South China Seas issue, I think, would be best solved if all of them could come together not only on a code of conduct, but also on the sharing of the supposed riches that are there, including fishing rights, etc. There needs to be a formula so that people can rely on that, and there has to be an enforcement mechanism so that people are not just treading on each other's situations. So that would be it. And I think China has to be a little bit more creative when it comes to that issue.
But when you say creative, I mean you mean conciliatory.
Yep. Yes, creative. I mean, in the sense that it would be much better if China, for instance, were to say the South China Seas is for the benefit of all the neighbors. And rather than drawing lines around it, we'll sit together as neighbors and we'll figure out a formula that makes sense for everybody, not only in the sharing of fishing rights, but also in terms of the oil, gas, minerals, whatever is down there. They will never be developed as long as there are disputes. So it would make more sense for everybody to get together and benefit from what is badly needed. Most of these companies need that energy. So developing would be very beneficial. China has the wherewithal. They have they can build offshore platforms. They have, they successfully operate a lot of energy, platforms. They can do it. So, and they have the money. So it would make sense for everyone to get together and do that. But that's up to the Beijing government.
So Jay, I see you can agree that China being more creative, as Einar put it, would be a win-win for all. But do you see China kind of cooperating on that level, sitting down and really talking to its regional neighbors in the South China Sea?
Well, I also am of the same view that they need to be creative and conciliatory. In fact, they should be more reserved in a way, restrained, I guess, is the proper term. And this seemed to be the track it was on in the 1990s when I started on this. So it was very optimistic period at the time, but for some reason, I guess under the current government, Xi Jinping, with its rather, shall we say, the Chinese dream, and there's a shade of xenophobia there as well, no? And it's like there's always this need to show that they're powerful and are very strong. I think that is the one that is bearing down on the smaller countries and making them extremely suspicious and uncomfortable. So it has to change that. No, it does have, as Einar mentioned, it has have that potential. But I'm afraid that in the past couple of years, it simply has squandered the opportunities that it had to become a real leader in the region that was looked up to, and instead, it's becoming more and more of a bully, as was mentioned by Greg, and that's really unfortunate.
Okay, Jay, I will have to give you the last word.
I would disagree with that characterization in the sense that RCEP was in fact joined by all of these groups by ASEAN. So it's not completely one way. I mean, it's just how you get these economic push and the political push going in the same direction.
Okay, Einar, we will have to end it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment of Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for joining us. Now, it is the ultimate battle of the billionaires. Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos have conquered the business world. Now they hope to conquer outer space. Branson's Virgin Galactic company beat Bezos's Blue Origin New Shepard to be the first to soar beyond the stratosphere. The cost of these projects is astronomical, and critics argue that money would be much better spent elsewhere. So, are they right? Is this a case of billionaires on an ego trip, or are Bezos and Branson contributing to a better future for all of us at their expense? Well, joining me now from Yamaguchi, Japan, is economics professor Patrick Collins. He's been researching and writing about space tourism for decades, and he's also the co-founder of Space Renaissance International. It's an organization with the self-proclaimed mission to get humanity off the world. Thank you so much for being with us. Okay, to what end is this level of money being spent? Is it ultimately, just for the indulgence, really, of a few people?
No, I don't think so. I think developing space travel is one of the most useful things that can be done. That is space travel for the general public. It's worth remembering that in 1957, Britain had the SR-53, a supersonic rocket plane, and they were developing the S-77, which was due to fly almost to space in 1957. But the projects were scrapped, and no progress was made since then. So for Richard Branson to use his company to a space travel service for the general public is great, and I think it's very good for the economy and also for society. And
but how so? I mean,
people tend to forget.
How does it translate to people like me and you, other than entertainment and fascination with space?
Right. Well, I think that it's worth thinking of it as like the air travel industry, which initially only very rich people could travel by air. And it's got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And now with the low-cost carriers, literally anyone, you can travel from London to Italy for £20. And space travel will be the same. It'll just get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And at the moment, these very short flights are $200,000 or $300,000. But Burt Rutan, who designed Branson's vehicle, has said himself that a suborbital flight will cost eventually about $400. So, at that price, even at a few thousand, millions and millions of people will travel. And so just for the economy, I think creating a new industry is going to be very valuable.
Okay, that's actually a very interesting comparison to make, that the early stages of air travel never would have envisioned, commercial flights for $40 round trip between country to country that we have today. But what's different, I think, about space travel is if we look at the examples set by NASA, for example, NASA has not been able to land another man on the moon since it was done decades ago. So how much can these, public-private hybrid projects really achieve if NASA hasn't been able to get there again?
A very good question. The thing is that, government organizations always work for political reasons. And so in the 60s, there was a political reason to go to the moon. But that hasn't happened since then. For business, once businesses make money doing something, then you can kind of predict they'll carry on doing it and make it a bigger and bigger business. And the key here is reusable vehicles. Apart from the space shuttle, still space agencies just use rockets that are only used once. And that's incredibly expensive. And so already both Branson and Jeff Bezos have developed reusable vehicles. Now, the suborbital flight is just the first step. But as soon as you use reusable vehicles, then the more you use them, the cheaper it gets, instead of being very high cost every time. So long as they develop reusable vehicles to go to orbit and then to go to the moon, all of the activities will get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper.
Okay. That's a good argument, but there are other arguments as well. I mean, you'll remember in particular, George W. Bush promised a man, when he first took office, he wanted NASA to kind of reclaim its prominence, especially in American society. He promised that we'd get a man back on the moon in 2020. His NASA chief, Michael Griffin, said that we would actually be able to see a man on Mars by 2037, and that was just with the basic budget that had been promised to NASA of about $17.5 billion back at the time per year. How are we not even close? I mean, these are NASA engineers working on this with the budget that they said they would need to be able to accomplish man on the moon by 2020, man on Mars by 2037. Why aren't we there?
Again, I think it's the difference between government organizations and private organizations. The motivation, for going back to the moon for NASA, it's not a thing that the general public are pressing to pay for. Taxpayers aren't particularly keen to pay for it all again.
Okay.
Whereas companies, live by providing services that customers want to buy.
What about the Concorde then?
Well, yes, but Concorde, interestingly, the market research showed that it would never be profitable, that there just aren't enough people who want to pay a high price to travel fast to other countries. It's a well-known problem that traveling faster isn't a thing that most people want to spend more money on. So it was market research predicted that Concorde would not be a success, and it was right. Whereas now market research shows that really everybody would like to travel to space if it gets cheap and safe enough.
Okay. Final question for you. I mean, you have actually talked about, really the next frontier, that there could be, we used to learn about space colonies back in the 80s, that was, kind of a goal of how to move humans off this planet and onto another. Once we became, in need of more land and expansion into the realm of space. What is actually possible? What do you see as far as human presence in space going forward? That's starting with these billionaires now.
Right. The key, as I said, is reusable vehicles to orbit. Once we have those, you may know that Robert Bigelow's company already has a module of a space hotel at the space station. The International Space Station has his waiting. He said, he wants to operate a space hotel. He just has to wait until passengers can get there. At the moment, they have to pay, tens of millions to get to orbit. So once we have reusable vehicles to getting to orbit, the hotel industry, there will be dozens of hotels in orbit. And they will build bigger and bigger spaces because it's fun, So I think we'll have sports stadiums in orbit. And then, once you can get to orbit, you can get to the moon and landing on the moon. A key thing here is to develop construction technology on the moon. And you know that China, Russia, and NASA have all said they're going to build bases on the moon. Okay. Now, I think the single most important thing for them to do is to learn to construct buildings there, concrete, glass, and aluminium. And the Lunar Olympics is the next target. Sometime in the 2040s, the Lunar Olympics would be a very popular event, I suspect.
That is quite a vision. Professor Patrick Collins, thank you so much for sharing it with us. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. Really thank you for joining us, and to our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. We'll see you next time.